Howdy Guardians. The build I will be showing you today utilizes one of the most underrated subclasses in PvE to output highly competitive damage whilst also buffing your entire team's damage output and survivability. Not only will we be ranking high among burst damage builds, we also have incredible ability uptimes and crowd control. This build has many moving parts, but this video will break them down individually before bringing them all together, showcasing how they shine. The moving parts of this build will be broken down into the following categories: exotics, world modifiers, subclass modifiers, debuffs, empowering buffs, amplification buffs, and weapon perks and mods. Let's get into it. Starting off, the exotic of choice for this build is the Mask of Brachus. This is an exotic hunter helmet with the exotic perk Light Shift. The aforementioned perk reads, replaces your Stasis subclass dodge ability with a longer range, faster moving shift that partially cloaks you during use. After shifting, your arc weapons deal increased damage to combatants for a short time, and you deal increased damage to all slowed or frozen combatants. One key thing to note here is that while the exotic perk is active, the user's dodge will not begin to recharge until the perk subsides. Now, let's look at some numbers. When active, the exotic perk grants the user a bonus of 10% increased arc weapon damage, as well as a 10% increased damage to targets afflicted with stasis. While most builds will focus on the bonus to arc damage, we will be primarily looking at the latter section of the exotic perk, which provides bonus damage to frozen or slowed combatants. Due to reasons covered in a later section of this video, we will be using weapons with a stasis affinity, thus nullifying the 10% increase to arc weapon damage. Why are we using this exotic and not some of the heavy hitters like Starter Scales or Gear Falcons? Let's first look at Starter Scales. This exotic is typically king when it comes to burst DPS. However, its biggest weakness is in its uptime. In order to take full advantage of this exotic and make it competitive, the user must have their super fully charged and collect 4 orbs of power, which is not always possible in encounters with rapid damage phases. What about Gear Falcons? This is an interesting exotic because it allows the user to self-apply a 35% buff to their weapon damage. However, this does not stack with other buffs, such as Blessing of the Sky, Radiant, or Empowering Rift. The Mask of Brachus shines here as the 10% bonus damage to targets afflicted with stasis does stack with other common buffs, allowing the user to theoretically output a higher yield of DPS. To summarize, the Mask of Brachus is being used here as it will stack with other parts of this build, allowing the user to output more damage. To bridge off the bonus damage to stasis afflicted combatants that the Mask of Brachus gives us, the next facet of this build is our stasis subclass, stasis damage, and interactions with the target. This is by far the most complicated section of this build, as much of the information here is not common knowledge. Let's go ahead and change that. When a target is affected by the stasis affliction frozen, the target takes a bonus 5% damage from the following sources: heavy weapons, special weapons, and any light affinity based abilities. What's even better about this is that the 5% increase in damage is not only available to the player who originally froze the target. Any one of your fire team members can benefit from this bonus. Just to note, this bonus also does stack with the Mask of Brachus' exotic perk. Freezing a target not only applies a bonus to damage, it also does damage when broken. When a frozen target receives enough damage, it will shatter, causing the target to take shatter damage. This damage is not monumental, however, it does add up. We're going to want to run Dust Fields as our grenade of choice. To make this even more powerful, we will be picking Grim Harvest as our first aspect and Touch of Winter as our second aspect. Grim Harvest will provide us with a way to produce stasis shards and get melee energy back up quicker. The melee aspect of this is not very important, but the more ability uptime you have, the better. Touch of Winter, on the other hand, will drastically aid in our efforts to freeze combatants as it increases the size of our grenade's area of effect and provides us with stasis crystals in the center. For fragments, we're going to want to run Whisper of Impetus, Whisper of Durance, Whisper of Conduction, Whisper of Chains, and Whisper of Shards. The two most important fragments here are Impetus and Durance. Whispers of Impetus will allow us to have more uptime on our damage by allowing us to bypass long reload animations. Whisper of Durance, on the other hand, will allow the duration of our Dustfield grenade to be 2 times longer than its base, and allow the slow and freezing effect to last 2 times as long as well. Whisper of Conduction will make it easier for us to collect our stasis shards, while Whisper of Shards will gain us bonus grenade ability regen when we shatter a stasis crystal, which, conveniently, can be found in the middle of our Dustfield grenade. Lastly, Whisper of Chains is used to provide us with resist ×1 when near a frozen target. This equates to a 10% increase in damage resist in PvE activities. Last but not least, we have our super, Silence and Squall. While this is not an optimal super for dealing damage, it does rapidly apply freeze and tracks onto our target, which allows for more uptime on our damage interactions. Our debuff of choice in this build is going to be Divinity. This will grant us a 30% increase to damage against afflicted targets. However, with an impending nerf slated to release in Season 19, taking the debuff percentage from 30 to 15, any 30% debuff would work with this build. If you're watching this video in Season 19 or later, I would suggest using Tractor Cannon or Hunter's Deadfall Tether Super. Both currently apply a 30% debuff to targets. Moving on to our empowering buffs, we're going to be wanting to use Blessing of the Sky, which can be acquired by being hit with a noble round from the exotic Kinnikin and Lumina. This perk grants the user a 35% empowering buff that lasts for a total of 10 seconds and can be refreshed by the gun's user while the perk is still active. Preferably, you'd want a fire team member to be the one applying this buff so as not to lose out on damage uptime due to swapping weapons. However, if that is not possible, you could be the one applying this buff, just expect to lose some total damage due to weapon swapping. You may be wondering why we are choosing Lumina over something like Well of Radiance. Well, due to buff stacking limitations, the game will choose the highest percentage buff and apply it to your damage. So Well of Radiance will still be useful due to the survivability it provides, as well as an exotic interaction such as Lunafaction Boots. However, the empowering buff it applies is less than Blessing of the Sky at 25%. Whilst empowering buffs do not stack on top of each other, there is another type of buff that does stack. These are referred to as amplification buffs. For the sake of this build, and maximum damage output, we are going to be running both Power of Rasputin and Font of Might. Starting off, Font of Might will provide us with a total of 25% increase in weapon damage to weapons that match our subclass's affinity. This works well with our build since we can pair it with Revenant Hunter subclass and Reed's Regret. As for Stasis Wells, there are a few ways we can produce these. The easiest method is to have a Well of Radiance Warlock run the Stasis combat style mod Supreme Wellmaker, which will spawn 3 Stasis Wells upon casting Well of Radiance. However, for solo content, we could also run the Stasis combat style mod Elemental Shards, which will allow the Stasis Shards produced from shattering our Dustfield Grenade Stasis Crystal to count as Wells of Light. To increase our damage even further, we are going to want to run Power of Rasputin, which will allow Warmind cells to buff our damage against combatants close to them by 10%. Last but not least, we have our weapon perks and mods. As mentioned in earlier sections, the weapon of choice for this build is going to be Reed's Regret with Triple Tap and Firing Line. Triple Tap will increase the amount of damage we can output before reloading, whilst Firing Line will increase our weapon's damage by 20% when near 2 or more allies. As for weapon mods, we are going to want to run Bospect or Adept Big Ones, both of which apply a bonus 7.8% increase to our weapon's damage. Now for the moment of truth. When combining all aspects of this build, we are left with a 288% increase in total damage output. This is larger than most other increases in the current damage meta. For a general overview, in this build, we are going to be wanting to run the Mask of Brachus exotic helmet on Revenant Hunter with Marksman Dodge and Dustfield Grenades. We will have Touch of Winter and Grim Harvest as our aspects of choice. For fragments, we are going to want to run Whisper of Impetus, Whisper of Durance, Whisper of Conduction, Whisper of Chains, and Whisper of Shards. The required mods for this build are going to be Power of Rasputin and Font of Might. For bonus Font of Might uptime, you can also run multiple copies of it alongside Elemental Time Dilation. Lastly, for weapons, we are going to be wanting to run Reed's Regret with Triple Tap and Firing Line, as well as Bospect or Adept Big Ones. We're also going to be needing a Fire Team member to run Lumina, Divinity, and Grasp of the Warmind in order to apply Power of Rasputin. After all this, you may find yourself asking, why should I run this over a Blade Barrage Starter Scales build? There are a few reasons for this. Number 1, in Season 19, the Blade Barrage Super will be receiving a nerf to its total amount of projectiles, reducing its total overall damage. 2, with this build, you will be applying a bonus 5% increase to your team's entire damage output through the use of Stasis. 3, this build synergizes very well with the current DPS meta of Stasis Titans and Reed Regrets due to easy access of Stasis Shards and Font of Might. 4, this build does not rely on seasonal artifact mods like countless other builds. And 5, this build is not slated to be nerfed in the slightest in the near future. Having presented that, I give to you the ultra-competitive Hunter Stasis damage build, which I personally use for in-game content and top 100 clears. For more builds and Destiny content, make sure to subscribe and follow on all social media platforms linked below, and join our clan's Discord. I also want to give a huge shout out to some of my clan members, Thor, Regdor, and Belt, for helping with the collection of footage and information for this build.